Pastor Gino Jennings' voice has been roaring from the pulpit for years, preaching truth, discipline, and purity. However, what occurs when the cameras stop recording behind closed doors? One of his own kids just made the decision to speak up, sharing what it was truly like to grow up in the shadow of one of America's most divisive preachers. Everyone was taken aback by his remarks, which permanently altered public perception of the Jennings family. Controversy is nothing new to Gino Jennings. Millions of people have viewed and debated his sermons on social media since they went viral. One of the most vocal voices in contemporary Christianity, Jennings gained notoriety for his unabashed preaching and straightforward approach. What transpires, though, when that same unyielding authority enters the house? After one of his sons came forward with his version of events, people began to ask that question. It wasn't just an emotional confession, it exposed the layers of a guy whose public persona has always been one of rigid obedience, sanctity, and control. For many years, Jennings was considered a spiritual giant by many of his followers. However, his son presents a completely different image behind the pulpit, one that will make you reevaluate everything you believe to be true about faith and family, as well as one that is full of strain and sacrifice. We are delving deeply into what it was like to be a child of Gino Jennings in this video. You'll hear the reality straight from the people who experienced it, from the unrelenting expectations to the few moments of vulnerability to the hidden costs of growing up with one of the most influential religious voices. Additionally, your perspective of Gino Jennings and his ministry may change by the conclusion. However, that is only the start. Because new concerns about control, leadership, and the hazy boundary between fear and faith emerged as more family stories emerged. And believe me, everything will change when you hear what comes next. The Jennings family did not provide a typical Christian upbringing. On the exterior, it appeared flawless, a well-behaved household run by a father who is deeply religious. However, there were enormous expectations behind those closed doors. Every thought, every action, and every word had to follow one unbreakable law: maintain the reputation of Gino Jennings. His children learned early on that they carried a ministry in addition to a family name. They couldn't be ordinary children. They were the children of a guy who inspired millions of people. Sunday wasn't the only day of church. It happened every day. And the expectations are higher than most people can think of. Classmates and friends would discuss sports, movies, and weekend plans. However, the topics of discussion in the Jennings home were scripture, sermons, and righteousness. Any sign of disobedience or hesitation was promptly dispelled. Discipline wasn't unkind to Gino Jennings. It was devotion. However, to a child raised with such mindset, it was pressure and unseen burden that never seemed to go away. His grown son paints a vivid picture of that sensation. He describes how his father's stirring remarks reverberate through the church walls as he sits in the front pew every Sunday. Words that called for sacrifice, obedience, and holiness. Living in the spotlight was something you never asked for. You could make mistakes, he said. Normalcy is impossible for you. You needed to be flawless, and there was a price for that perfection. Imagine as a youngster being told all the time that your actions reflect the ministry. Your family and your father's reputation could be tarnished by just one poor choice. A person can be shaped or broken by that kind of pressure. Conversations weren't informal at home. There were teachings on accountability, sin, and purity. Free speech was frequently interpreted as disrespectful, and laughter was uncommon. Gino Jennings was viewed by the public as a man of conviction, but his children saw someone who could quickly transform from a devoted father to a powerful preacher. At times, his son acknowledged that he had a great deal of admiration for his father, the strength of Gino's voice when he preached, the assurance with which he led hundreds, and the way he resolutely faced his detractors. However, there were also times of subdued animosity. His son admitted, "I didn't know who I was outside of him. His identity, his vision, his mission, it was all about him. I had no idea what I was supposed to see." Much of his youth was characterized by this ongoing conflict between deference and disobedience. The dread of being perceived as a letdown kept him from venturing out every time. He was constantly reminded of his duty whenever he attempted to show his individuality. And that silent fight only intensified as he grew older. Because behind the scenes, concerns about freedom, faith, and what happens when devotion becomes dominance started to surface. Silence was the best option for years. The Jennings family didn't simply expect devotion, they demanded it. Leadership was not questioned by you didn't challenge doctrine, and you most definitely didn't challenge the family's head, a man of God. However, silence has a way of increasing pressure, and each word that is left unsaid adds a stone to the burden you bear. Gino Jennings's family's seclusion decreased as his influence spread over the world. His sermons, which were frequently vehement and contentious, would make news and generate discussions online. His son silently bore the rumors and the comparisons while Gino flourished in the limelight. At church, people would grin and remark, "You're just like your father." However, he wasn't. He struggled on the inside to meet a standard he never set for himself. He started to see the little fissures. There were times when trust was more like terror. On some days, he wanted to know why everything had to be so rigid, why grace appeared conditional, and why love felt like it was dependent on compliance. However, such inquiries were nonetheless sealed off, because challenging authority was viewed as rebellion in that household, and rebellion was equated with sin. Years of emotional exhaustion, lengthy sermons at home, and the pressure to lead, pray, and serve while repressing his own misgivings all contributed to the gradual breaking point. One evening after a service, he remembers sitting by himself and gazing at the platform where his father had once delivered a sermon on openness and truth. His words, "It hit me. If we were concealing so much suffering, how could we teach the truth?" There were silent, tension-filled nights behind the well-rehearsed sermons and precisely timed passages. At times, his mother would act as a mediator, attempting to strike a balance between the stern authority of a preacher and the sensitive feelings of a kid who merely wanted to be noticed. Gino's fervor for morality occasionally came out as harsh, and love frequently felt like correction to his kids. That internal struggle reached a breaking point as his son grew older. He desired to discover his own voice, one that was distinct from Gino Jennings' shadow, the church, and dogma. However, he was aware that doing so would result in criticism. It was like entering a storm when you left the protection of the ministry. Nevertheless, he decided. He chose to live in silence for a while, away from the scrutiny, and separated himself from the church. At that point, introspection started. The imposed silence turned into a healing one, and his viewpoint evolved over time. He wanted more than to rebel. He wanted to know. He wanted to share his tale because it was true, not because he was resentful. The internet went crazy when he eventually made his public speech. Gino Jennings's followers hurried to the preacher's defense. Others, however, sympathized with the son's candor. He didn't say anything disrespectful. They were unpolished. When he said, "I love my father," however, love cannot make pain go away. I discovered that holiness is not about being afraid. The truth is at issue. Like wildfire, that one statement spread. It was picked up by podcasts. It was discussed by religious pundits. And social media was overflowing with responses. Some referred to it as bravery. Some viewed it as treachery. But regardless of how it was seen, one thing was for sure. Now, a new facet of the Jennings legacy has been revealed to the public. People started posing the more profound queries for the first time. What does being raised under spiritual guidance actually mean? To what extent should a religious leader have authority at home? And at what point does discipline become oppressive? Gino Jennings himself would eventually comment, which further muddled matters, and his supporters would be rocked by that reaction. The tale quickly made its way to the pulpit after it was reported that Gino Jennings' son had come up. Clips began to circulate within weeks, brief, scathing excerpts from recent sermons that appear to address the controversy without specifically mentioning any names. However, the message was clear to those who knew. Gino stood before a crowded audience in one of his now viral lectures, his voice unflinching and his eyes sharp. The audience exploded in cheers as he said, "When you're chosen by God, the devil will use anyone, even family, to try to silence the truth." This was spiritual warfare to his disciples. It was diversion to his detractors. But it was personal to his son. Two universes colliding was depicted in that instant. the private father tending to a wound that had been swollen for years, and then the public preacher defending his vocation. The boundaries between family and religion started to become hazy. Advocates intensified their attacks, accusing Gino of being betrayed. "He's being attacked for preaching holiness," a churchgoer wrote on the internet. Others weren't as sure. Another person said, "Why can't he acknowledge his son's pain if truth is truth?" The Jennings family apparently went into a period of silence behind the scenes. Only sermons that seemed to contain subliminal messages, no interviews, no formal declarations. He spoke more and more about loyalty, submission, and the perils of revolt week after week. It sounded to many like a father preaching while in anguish. This is when the tale becomes more complex. Because the pulpit has always been Gino Jennings' battleground, he has never shied away from conflict in his sermons. Whether it's in opposition to detractors who question his authority, rival denominations, or cultural trends. The opposition, however, wasn't new this time. Blood was involved. The force in his son's voice was unusual. It had nothing to do with rage. Experience was the source of it. After decades of following Gino, some started thinking about their own families. Some drew comparisons between kids who adore their parents but fall short of their unrealistic expectations. Others witnessed bravery, a young guy who refused to be defined by his silence. Scandal started to give way to something more profound in the public discourse, a discussion about discipline, the cost of perfection, and faith across generations. However, Gino's reaction went beyond sentimentality. It was calculated. He discussed endurance in a subsequent speech, emphasizing that genuine Christians are put to the test by hardship rather than by ease. Many saw it as a reminder and a warning, even if he did not name his son. He believed that the ministry was holy, and that defending it required being strong, even at the expense of his closest friends and family. Reconciliation attempts occurred in private, according to those with knowledge of the issue. Phone conversations that ended poorly, letters were sent and never returned, a profound rift that faith by itself was unable to quickly heal. For the son, it was about being honest and ending the long-standing silence that had prevented him from being seen. Maintaining the structure of a spiritual home he had constructed from the ground up was important to the father. It wasn't helped by the media coverage. Speculation increased as the tale was taken up by online blogs, podcasts, and YouTube channels. The son was accused of attention-seeking by some. Others supported him as a man taking back his story. Every comment, every clip, and every upload fueled a fire that would not go out. But in the midst of all the chaos, something extraordinary started to take place. Real discussions about family traumas, church culture, and leadership that occasionally overlooks the human cost of holiness began to take place amongst people on both sides. Gino was no longer the exclusive focus. It was about every child of a preacher who has ever felt invisible. Gino continued to preach in the middle of it all. Thousands of people continued to attend his sermons. He remained steadfast in his belief. Even his most devoted fans, however, could detect a shift, a little heaviness in his voice, a hesitation for some phrases. The man who had always talked so confidently seemed to be carrying a silent shadow of introspection. Regardless of who misinterpreted him, he felt he was carrying out God's purpose, even though he never again addressed the issue explicitly. His kid, however, received a different message. Truth should never be silenced by faith. Two men who stood firmly on opposing sides of the same conviction, separated by belief and tied by blood. Something unexpected rekindled the issue just when it appeared to be dying down. Not via social media or the sermon, but straight from the Jennings family's own heart. Gino Jennings' son sat down for what would turn out to be one of the most talked about interviews in the Christian world, months after the first wave of protests. For the first time, he spoke freely, painfully honestly, and not in rage. His remarks were serene, introspective, and brimming with the kind of reality that only results from years of silence coming to an end. He started by clarifying that he wasn't motivated by retaliation when he decided to come up. "I wasn't trying to destroy my father," he stated. "I just wanted to live without pretending anymore." The Jennings name had been associated with power, strength, and togetherness for years, so that statement alone caused a stir on the internet. Now, however, there were rumors of cracks that had been meticulously concealed from the public. He talked about his early years in the interview, not to embarrass others but to illuminate what it's really like to grow up in the presence of a godly guy. He explained his father's dual nature as a strict preacher who demanded unquestioning devotion and a kind man who taught him discipline and the Bible. He acknowledged that there were moments when I wanted to give him a hug, but I wasn't sure whether it was okay. Something resonated with that line. People's reactions on social media were emotional. Many found his statements to be a reflection of their own experiences. Children of devoutly religious parents who believed that love was something that had to be earned rather than something that was given to them freely. Others found it to be an enlightening look at the unspoken price of preserving spiritual power. When he was asked if he had forgiven his father later in the conversation, however, that was when the actual revelation occurred. He stopped, inhaled deeply, and said something nobody had anticipated. "Yes," he muttered, "since clinging to hurt only makes you into what wounded you, I've forgiven him a long time ago." Everything changed in that instant. What started out as disagreement evolved into discussion on legacy, forgiveness, and generational pain. Many of Gino's most devoted supporters acknowledged feeling moved. True strength looks like that. But the discoveries didn't end there. One reader commented, "Not silence, but peace." The Sun continued by disclosing that there had been private attempts to re-establish contact in spite of the public backlash. He said, "We've spoken since then. It wasn't simple. Although it wasn't a cure-all, it was a start." Behind the scenes, family members confirmed that there had been quiet meetings, without cameras, congregations, or crowds, just family conversations where apologies were made not in sermons, but in tears. For the first time, however, we spoke as two men, not preacher and son. Outside that private circle, however, the world continued to watch, and news outlets started publishing new stories. Commentators argued whether Gino Jennings' ministry could ever be viewed in the same way again, arguing that it humanized him and that even powerful men have family issues. Although Gino didn't directly address the interview or criticize his son, those close to him noticed subtle changes in him as his sermon started to include more references to grace, understanding, and the importance of love and leadership, all of which were crucial for a man once defined by unshakable conviction. Others said it exposed the danger of combining spiritual authority with parental control. It was evident from those small changes that something had changed, or at least softened, inside him. Perhaps it was the understanding that no sermon could erase the pain of a misinterpreted childhood, or perhaps it was the silent acceptance that even men of God have to face their humanity. This realization not only reshaped the Jennings family, but it also helped many others who had previously felt silenced by faith. What started as one family's fracture turned into a movement toward honesty and healing. People started sharing their own stories on forums, podcasts, and churches, including pastors, kids, churchgoers, and even former followers. For the Jennings family, this wasn't about public forgiveness or fame. The topic was truth, because once uttered, truth liberates rather than merely exposes, and inside that liberation, there was something restorative that even Gino's son acknowledged he never anticipated.